All right, so we're doing chapter 5 today. Now, one of the things that I wanted to mention is something that kind of comes up in the discussion sections. Usually, somebody is going to bring it up in every section, and that is something called the Mozart effect. Now, you can look up the Mozart effect, there's whole websites on it. You'll also notice that most of the websites are dated around 2000 or 1995. When it says 2000, that's because they were kind of updated. It's still around 1995. What the Mozart effect is, and again, this time we're still talking about babies, but we're talking about their cognitive and then later on emotional development. But right now it's cognitive in chapter 5. Um, the Mozart effect is the idea that they found through some research that if you play Mozart for babies, then this will make them smarter. And they threw a whole bunch of reasons in here. They said that it helps stimulate neural growth for whatever reason. And this got really, really popular. There's there's a Disney, I forget the name of it off the top of my head. There's a Disney show called like Baby Mozarts or Baby Einsteins or some crap like that. I don't know, I forget what it is. There's an entire like Baby Mozart movement. You can buy stuff. It's a huge marketing thing. And yet I would encourage anybody, especially those that went ahead and posted about the Baby Mozart thing, and anybody that posts about that. Like I said, I don't consider whether you're right or wrong as far as this. I'm just glad that you look stuff up. Do a Google search, and when you look up anything scholarly on a Google search, just type in the word scholar. And then the first thing that'll pop up is Google Scholar, and this is a whole wealth of information here. So in a Google Scholar search, um, type up Baby Mozart, and you'll get a whole lot of articles from around 1998, 1999, talking about how, and on the side, they're literally full PDFs to the actual articles written by the scientists. And trust me, I hate journalists. These people are just downright evil, I'll be very honest with you. They barely understand what they're talking about most of the time, and they talk about things that are neat to them, and more importantly, they'll interpret information the way that kind of fits how their life has already been going. So if they say to themselves, it's like, you know what, I can really see Mozart making babies smarter because that's classical music and that's cultured and dignified and all these good things we like to pretend that it is when it's really just music. Um, so that's what they'll report on, and then they totally missed all the vast amounts of data, the stuff that you pull up on the Google Scholar search, talking about how there's basically no effect to be found. There isn't cognitive development. The cognitive development that was found was based on other things. The fact that these children were stimulated by other things other than just Mozart. If you just have 100 babies and 50 of them you play Mozart to, and 50 of them you don't have them listen to any music at all, there's no significant differences whatsoever between the babies. Um, or for that matter, and this was a Disney thing. There's a thing called I think it is Little Einsteins or something like that. Those of you who are parents will uh, have this jog their memory, or anybody that has kids that watches even PBS. This is something that's on PBS and a lot of the cable channels. Um, and this huge line of how to make your babies smarter. And uh, it's all been researched and it's all total bunk. It has absolutely no bearing on the cognitive capacity of children. Once we get into how children work a little bit, and this chapter is mostly looking at what children can learn, their cognitive capacities, we'll see that babies have a lot of modeling behaviors. And this is why culture is so important to the development of babies, both the physical development and the cognitive development of babies, the emotional, the social, all this sort of stuff. Because what's important to the culture at large is going to be what becomes important to the baby. So the things you will be influencing your children with are going to be things that you're not even trying to influence your children with. And I say this to all my classes whenever we go over the developmental section. So I'm sure this will ring a bell for anybody that's done a developmental class. If if what you do when you come home from a hard day's work is sit down, grab a beer, and play video games. Take a wild guess what your children are going to find important. What are they going to do? If you want your children to read, you don't read to them. I mean, you can if you just want to spend some quality time with your children, and that's fine. But if you actually want your children to read, they're going to do it because they see that after a hard day's work, you come home and you read to relax. They're going to see, oh, relax. Reading is a fun thing to do. It's not something you do just because you're forced to do it. And this sort of thing is the same thing. When you get into modeling behavior, as we'll really get into later on, it's definitely going to be because they see a whole lifestyle of this. And so this is the sort of thing that really kicks into play here. Do you listen to music all the time? Well, then your child will probably listen to music all the time. This, by the way, is why 20-year-olds don't make good parents. And why when you're, the ideal breeding age is actually around the age of 28. And most of that is because you've gotten over a lot of this kind of childish stuff. You don't define, by the time you're 28, 30, you no longer define yourself by the type of music you listen to. That's kind of a childish thing that we do as a teenager. We kind of grow out of it later on. You define yourself by what you can accomplish, by who you are, not by the types of artists you happen to dig. I mean, you still enjoy music later on, but there's a lot more important aspects of yourself that you define yourself by. So the Mozart stuff, I'd highly encourage people to look it up. It's very interesting. Now, one of the things that we want, I'm going to keep looking over here because these are where my notes are on a different computer screen off to the side. One of the things that we're going to have is, you'll notice, especially at this point, that the rest of the book is going to be organized, at least up until the age of 12, organized by Piaget and Erikson. So when we get into the cognitive things, all of Piaget's theories, we went into this a little bit before, all of his theories are definitely cognitive. It's all about the physical capacities that the child has. And like I said, Piaget kind of peters out after about the age of 12, and his theories are kind of done. We'll then move into Vygotsky and Erikson and some of the other ones. We'll be concentrating on them the whole way, but they have a lot more staying power than Piaget does. He doesn't really care after puberty. And so he's really going to get in, and we're in what's called the sensory motor stage of Piaget. And so this is where your whole learning, this goes up until about the age of 2, which is why, by the way, the book is organized so that talking about babies goes up till the age of 2. This is all because of Piaget. And the sensory motor stage is basically just talking about the fact that the only thing important for learning is senses and motor. Learning how to deal with your body. You look at a little baby before they're like 6 months old, that little crying spud can't even roll over. They are literally learning how to use their bodies. It's actually kind of fascinating to watch them. It gets boring after a while because it's 6 months. It drives you nuts as a parent because they don't do anything. And then senses, taking in the world, learning how we perceive. We had in the intro to psych class, you had a sensation and perception chapter. Sensation and perception is a fascinating part of development, fascinating part of psychology, because you're really talking about a very, very complex structure of what people can and can't do. Imagine trying to train a computer. And this is why we get into cognitive psychology to begin with, mostly because we have to train computers to do this. Imagine trying to train a computer. You have a video camera on your computer, and it's seeing everything, but what is it going to pay attention to? This is what a baby has to learn. And we're barely now getting software that can really recognize faces. It can pick a face out of a crowd. I put a picture up of my wife on Facebook the other day, and as soon as I posted it, it immediately put a little box around her face, and it says, do you want to, to tag your wife on this photo? And I'm like, wow, that's actually pretty impressive. That not only could it find her face in a fairly complex photo, but it then knew who it was. It knew that it scanned all the pictures of all the people that I was friends with, maybe the people that I had connections with more, and said, okay, I recognize this face. And that's fascinating, and little babies have to do this. They have to learn how to recognize faces, how to take all this perception in the world and figure out what to care about and what not to care about. And that's really complicated to do. Um, most of the stuff we see, we totally ignore, but as a baby, you don't. You have to learn, we're predisposed to like certain things and not like other things. Even as a little baby, after 2 months of age, they'll start to pay attention to faces and even recognize some faces. Um, Now, this sensory motor stage, more importantly than any of the other ones of Piaget's stages, he really splits this up into a whole bunch of sub-stages. Because obviously, a 1-month-old is totally different than an 18-month-old baby. And and so there's all these different substages up until the second stage. So for substage 1 and 2, you're going to notice that the difference between these babies and any other human in any stage of development is going to be that they have no capacity to understand the external environment. They have no environmental cues at all. And this is going to mean that they cannot learn from you. They cannot recognize you. They do not give a damn about you or anything that you do. And like I said, this goes for a couple of months, a couple of their stages. So this means a lot of things. The fact that these babies are not going to be concentrating on anything outside of themselves. They're thinking about how do they see, how do they control their senses, how do they move, how do they control their body. That's all they're concentrating about. Because of this really impacts how we have to get along with babies. First of all, there's a phrase that's highly misinterpreted in the research. The phrase is, you can't spoil a baby. And some people vehemently disagree with this. And if you hear somebody say, you can't spoil a baby, and you find yourself disagreeing with this fact, frankly, you need to check yourself a bit, because this is a fact. Maybe you don't understand the fact. Maybe that's where the confusion is. Maybe you don't understand that they're really talking about very specific types of babies. Maybe they don't mean certain types of spoiling. But a lot of people, you say this to them, and this is just a good example of kind of a problem that we have in psychology, where we have all these facts and people will just flat out choose not to believe them because they don't fit what they want to believe. They want to believe, like, no, you have to treat babies this specific way. So when they say you can't spoil a baby, what they're really talking about is that you can't spoil a baby in one of these two phases, either the first or second substage of the sensory motor stage of Piaget's development cycle. So let's say the first couple of months, they're not going to learn from you. You could literally, and honestly you should, treat them just like a chimpanzee treats their baby for the first 3 months, which is they have 99% of their time they're in physical contact with their child. They don't set them down. Humans are not, and it's a very strange cultural thing that we've developed in Europe and America, where we take a baby that's newborn and we put it in a little crib in its own room, as if every human needs their own room and their own, like, yards and yards of personal space. Um, and we do this kind of to elevate the importance of the baby, to almost to show the baby that we find it is important. Look, we gave you your own room. It doesn't know. It's crapping itself half the time. It knows nothing. All it knows is it wants physical contact with you, and it's not getting it. We're literally designed. This is why, if everybody ever wonders why babies breastfeed every 2 hours, and that's not an exaggeration, that's not spoiling the kid. Babies breastfeed every 2 hours for the first couple of months, even when they're sleeping. And everybody's like, well, what a pain in the butt it is. This is why women don't breastfeed. No, this should have nothing. This is not an inconvenience, because the baby's supposed to be sleeping next to you. You're not even supposed to wake up for it. Maybe you'll wake up just to, oh yeah, there you go, and then call it a day. The baby knows how to do this. He's sleeping next to you. You don't have a top on. Again, clothes are a relatively new phenomenon. Certainly nothing we evolved to adapt to. And the baby breastfeeds, and then it goes back to sleep. It breastfeeds while it's sleeping in a lot of cases. So for these first two stages, there's nothing you can do to spoil the kid. What you can do is rob them of the things that they need. And this is extremely high degrees of affection. Um, they need, I spoke of the Harlow monkey experiment, where they all went into how much affection different things needed. And if you rob a child of affection, it can have very severe, long-lasting implications. And keep in mind, this is at the age of a child where you don't know how, we'll just say, dumb the kid is. Your child might wind up being severely mentally retarded so that they'll only get, say, 60% of all, of the benefit of the affection you give them. So you've really got to give this kid a lot of affection now for the first couple of months. After that, they get into their other stages. They're going to be understanding the environment. By all means, they'll know you can spoil the kid then. So be careful when you doubt what people say as far as psychological facts go. In a lot of cases, it's a misunderstanding. Like, you don't know they're talking about the first 2 months, or in some cases you're just really insistent on your own very narrow temporal culture of, well, babies need to be in their own crib, when it's just flat out not true. We're really designed to be not alone all the time. Another thing you do want to be careful about is any talk, and there's a little bit of it in the book, where they talk a little too deeply about the cognitive structures that you have of people in this stage, in Piaget's first stage, a sensory motor, before the age of 2, about, you give or take a few months. And that's because, again, think like a scientist. Think about what we can measure and what we can't measure. How much of their thoughts can you really measure? You're going to notice a child doing something you can describe as exploring behavior. But are they doing it because they're curious? Are they doing it because they're afraid? Are they doing it because they're trying to learn? Are they doing it because they're forced to? Maybe they hate doing this. We really don't know, and there's no way in which we can find out. So basically, take the observations at face value. Exactly what we can know about these things. And whenever you see any sort of research, and again, you can, on Google Scholar, you can often just read the PDFs of the research that they actually did from the scientists' words. And you'll notice that the scientists usually don't jump to a lot of conclusions. If they say that the baby has exploring behavior as defined by picking up objects, tactile sensations, and visualizing things with their eyes, a journalist might go and say, well, babies love to explore, but the article itself didn't say that. They say they exhibit a lot of exploring behavior as defined by this thing. So it's a lot more interesting to read the actual articles, and honestly, thanks to Google, it's a fantastic source that we've never had in history for anybody in society to actually just read the journalist's words. If you find anything that a journalist says that is remotely scientific and you find it interesting, look it up. It's a wealth of information to see. Now we get into memory here a little bit, and they mention it in the book, and I wanted to go into recall and recognition memory a little bit, mainly because I use it a lot on my tests, and now that you've taken a test, I wanted to give you a heads up. The difference between recall memory and recognition memory is, one, you recognize something. Recognition memory, you see it and you're like, oh, okay, I remember what that is. The other one is recall. That means that just off the top of your head, you're going to recall this without having to see it, without having to have your memory jogged ahead of time. Obviously, recall memory is a lot more in depth. You're going to keep it for a lot longer. But in college, most people rely on recognition memory to get by tests. This will guarantee you a failing grade in my class, and frankly, in any professor who's really good at making tests. Any psychology professor, I would certainly hope so. Because we should know the difference between recognition and recall memory. I'll have, if you have a choice of 4 things to recognize on a multiple choice, you should recognize every single one of them. They should jog your memory. You have to know the difference between them. I'm not going to put one answer of something we talked about in class and then a bunch of crap that begins with the same first letter. This is all going to be stuff we talked about, things that were discussed in the book. Now, in this particular case, they talk about recognition and memory and recall memory as far as infants go. They go into that pretty well in depth in the book. Now, the last thing I'll probably get into in this, I'll continue chapter 5 next week, is the difference between IQ scores. We really try to get into IQ scores a lot in this particular stage, and I'll tell you why. Because at this stage, and first of all, IQ tests are a lot different than a lot of people know. Just yesterday, I had a colleague of mine post a link to an IQ test you could take online. It was 20 questions. It would tell you how smart you were. No, it won't. IQ tests, the one we currently use is called the Wechsler Standard Intelligence Test for Children. It takes 2 to 3 hours to implement. There are 14 sections. You play with blocks. It's not just a matter of how much do you know, because how much you memorize is an aspect of intelligence, but it's just one aspect of intelligence. There's a lot of other things you can examine in order to see exactly how intelligent you are. And you have to actually think what the purpose is of an intelligence test. I mean, why do you take one online? What's the purpose of that? Well, we all know the purpose of that. You want to get a high score. You want to brag to your friends that you're really smart. That's the only reason you would take an online intelligence test. So they're going to cater that test for that. They'll artificially inflate your IQ score. And they'll give you questions that are designed to test how much trivia you know and that sort of thing. But think about the test you're going to give to kids who are under the age of 2. You're really only interested in one thing. You don't care whether or not your child is gifted. If we're going to use that, instead of saying smart, because nobody wants to use smart, because that'll hurt people's feelings if they're not smart. So we'll be honest here. You're not testing to see if your kid is a genius. If your kid is a genius, you're not worried about the kid. You're not taking him to a psychologist and giving him an IQ test. You're just going to be thankful. You're going to call it a day, and that's it. If you're giving your kid an IQ test before the age of 2, it's because you think he's mentally retarded. So the IQ tests for children are designed to determine whether or not they're mentally retarded. After that, past the point of average, it doesn't really matter anymore. I know people that have children that are severely retarded. They give them IQ tests, and the test came out around 30 or 40. I said, well, what happened during the test? And he's like, well, there were 14 different sections. It took, they had the section where you played with blocks and you tried to put them in patterns. And I figured the kid would love that because it's playing with blocks. And so they gave him one thing and he did it. And then they gave him the next and he didn't bother. He ran around the room at that point, playing with the shutters or windows or something. So they're like, and this woman didn't think that the test really gave an accurate description of how intelligent he was. Because he could have done more. But he didn't, and that's part of an intelligence test. If you don't have the focus to play with blocks for more than 30 seconds, that's a pretty good indication of a lack of intelligence. And they really standardize these things for that purpose. So if you see intelligence tests, understand that that's the purpose of them. And they talk about IQ tests a little bit in the book. And in this country in particular, we get into IQ tests because everybody wants to be special. We're a country where we're all about the individual. We don't give a damn about anybody but ourselves. And we talked about physical development last time. One thing, kind of something that people say is whenever, kind of a classic, you're going to have a baby. They say, well, is it going to be a boy or a girl? A lot of people say, I don't care as long as it's healthy. Most people don't mean that. And I'm not saying they care whether or not it's a boy or girl, because frankly, a lot of people don't. But when they say healthy, they're usually talking about smart. I mean, if you have your choice, you're going to have a kid, and he's going to have a disability. Would you rather he was highly intelligent, yet going to be in a wheelchair his whole life, or fit as a fiddle and severely mentally retarded? I mean, what would your choice be? You'd probably prefer the kid who's going to be in a wheelchair his whole life and be highly intelligent. We really value intelligence. So we worry about it a great deal in our country, and yet at the same time, and I talked about this a little bit last time, the developmental milestones that you wind up going through are really, really variable. And it's like this throughout childhood, even to the things that are very obvious, like attractiveness. I mean, have you ever seen a kid who was a really ugly baby? Let's face it, a lot of them are not pretty. Ever seen a kid who was a really ugly baby, but then wound up being a pretty good-looking kid? Sometimes you can get a good-looking kid, winds up being an ugly teenager. Got a couple of friends of mine, homely as hell teenagers, attractive-looking adults. We call it ugly duckling or sometimes, but you can get the very opposite. You can get a kid who's a really attractive looking baby and then wind up being ugly later on. And honestly, all these stages are basically the same thing. You can get a kid who's really, really held back before the age of 2 and then catches up fine and does fantastic. There's a lot of reasons they're not doing that well. Heck, when I was a kid, I didn't roll over till 8 months old. I was my parents' third kid, so they weren't paranoid. If I was their first kid, they probably would have had me tested to see if I was retarded. But they didn't. Mentally retarded, obviously, in this case. But they didn't bother. They said, whatever, everybody develops at a different age. We know that now. I didn't bother roll over till 8 months of age. By 9 months of age, I was walking. And then my teachers did the exact same thing later on. When I was in 6th grade, I wasn't paying attention a lot, so they thought I might be mentally retarded, so they put me through this whole battery of tests. For 2 days, I actually was out of class for 2 days taking nothing but tests. Apparently one of them was the GED, and I passed. Intelligence wasn't my issue. My issue was totally different things. I was just emotionally and socially maturing at a very, very slow rate for reasons that we found out later. It turned out that I was just an eccentric and exceedingly odd. So don't look into whether or not somebody is held back too deeply. It's more significant if it's something that's going to be very, very long term. And at this stage, there's really no way you can find out if something is going to be long term. So don't jump to the conclusion that it's going to be. One of the worst things you can do is dwell on it and make it an issue, because then they're just going to identify that as they're building up their very core of their identity. I mean, I've seen kids take 2-year-olds and bring them into therapy for problems that's like, well, he was smacked around by his dad, so he needs therapy. No, he probably doesn't. He's gonna be okay. Being smacked around by his dad is not really something he's in the cognitive development stage of learning right now. An adult would be disturbed by that. The 2-year-old, not really. Unless, of course, you talk about it every day and tell him he's upset by it. So we're going to continue with this chapter later on. One of the advantages of being able to take a whole week to do a chapter in some cases is that we can get a couple lectures and really get in depth with some of these chapters that are a little bit more interesting, like the cognitive and emotional sections of infancy.